In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God created the entire world and all the things that we have in 6 days. On the sixth day, God created man and woman, Adam and Eve. He created them in his image, which means he created them to know him. God placed Adam and Eve in a garden and gave them a command to be fruitful and multiply. And God also gave them a prohibition, a rule to follow. And that was they could have of anything in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, Adam and Eve disobeyed God. They took the fruit from the tree, and because of that, sin entered into the world, and death and separation from God. But also in the garden, God made a promise that he would one day send a savior to rescue mankind and crush the head of the serpent. And he also gave a picture of redemption, and that is that he took an innocent animal, shed its blood, and covered Adam and Eve in its skin. When Adam and Eve left the garden, they had children, Cain and Abel. And we already see the destruction of sin when Cain killed Abel. Well, God replaced Abel with Seth, but we also continue to see that sin carries on and carries on throughout generations. The next thing that we see is that all of a sudden the world is populated with corruption. And God sees the world and says it should be destroyed. But there's one man who had favor with God, and it was Noah. And God told Noah that he was going to send a flood to kill all things on earth. But he was going to save Noah and his family. He instructed Noah to build an ark. And once the flood started, Noah got on the ark and his family was saved from the flood. After they left the ark, God also continued his promise, which was to be fruitful and multiply, and that he would carry out his promise of redemption through the family of Noah. Well, that happened, but we also see the other side, again, as generations pass, that we see sin continues. Well, we have a man named Abram. God chose Abram from a family of idol worshipers, and he made Abram a promise. And he told Abram that one day his family would be as many as the stars in the sky, and that through his family, all nations of the earth would be blessed. God made a promise, and he kept his promise. When Abraham now had a son named Isaac. One day, God wanted to test Abraham's faith in him, and he instructed Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son, Isaac, on an altar. But again, we see God showing himself that he is the great Redeemer, and he provided a substitute for Isaac by a ram. And God was showing that this is how sin is dealt with. It's through the innocent shedding its blood on behalf of the guilty. And so we see now that God is continuing his line through Abraham to Isaac. Well, eventually Isaac marries Rebekah and has 2 twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Now, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, so we now see the story turn towards Jacob as being the one who would carry the seed out. Well, Jacob goes to work for Laban, and he marries Rachel and Leah. And between that family, there are 12 sons that are born. One of those sons is Joseph. Joseph was the favored son of Jacob. And in fact, because of that caused the other brothers to be very jealous of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers into Egypt. The story turns to Joseph for a little while, and we see Joseph in Egypt, that he has also found favor in God's eyes, and he is fruitful and successful in all the things that he does. But eventually, Joseph is accused of something that he didn't do, and he is thrown into prison. But also there, we see the faithfulness of God in Joseph's life and Joseph's faithfulness towards God himself, and that he is able to be rescued out of prison, and then it eventually ends up serving Pharaoh and becoming second in command. Now, part of that is because Joseph interpreted some dreams for Pharaoh that God actually interpreted through Joseph, and said that there would be 7 years of plenty in the land, and then there would be 7 years of famine. So Joseph was put in charge of trying to figure out how were they going to survive. So Joseph took all the food in the land during that time of plenty and stored it up. So when the time of famine came, Egypt had food. So now we see where Joseph intersects with his family, Jacob and his brothers. See, Jacob and his brothers, they were also experiencing famine, and they needed to travel to Egypt to get food. So his brothers go to Egypt, and Joseph realizes who they are when he sees them, but he doesn't reveal himself. Well, after a series of events, eventually Joseph says this is who he was, that he was the one that was sold into slavery by them, and that God did all of this for the rescuing of his people. So Joseph invites Jacob and his family to move to a land next to Egypt to have food and grow and be numerous there. Well, hundreds of years pass, and what happens is that Joseph's family was forgotten, and they became slaves in Egypt. And they cry out to God to be rescued. And God raises up a man named Moses. And Moses is the one that's been chosen to deliver God's people out of slavery, out of Egypt, into the land that was originally promised to Abraham. So Moses does that. He goes to Pharaoh and he says to let the people go, but Pharaoh, his heart is hard. And so he chooses not to do that. And so there's 10 plagues that God brings on the people of Egypt, the 10th one being the death of the firstborn. And so God instructs his people to kill a lamb, to put the blood over their door, and he would pass over their door, but he would kill all the firstborn of Egypt. And so that happened. That's called the Passover. And so after that, the Egyptians said, you need to leave. And so God's people were able to flee Egypt and get out of Egypt and go into the desert. Well, then they had something in front of them called the Red Sea. And so how in the world were God's people going to be able to escape and get across the Red Sea? Well, God made a way, as he always does. Pharaoh had changed his mind and chased after God's people, but what God did was a miracle, is that he parted the Red Sea. The Israelites were able to walk through on dry land, and then the sea closed back over Pharaoh's army, and they all perished, but God's people were saved. The next part we see is that God's people are in the wilderness and they're remembering all the things that they had before in Egypt, and they're grumbling, but God in his grace and his mercy and his protection for his people, he provides manna, bread from heaven for his people. And then finally, we see in this section that God's people make it to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, and they are ready to become the people of God.